We have no options. We're going to die. Captain Morrison's voice shattered through the cabin speakers, sentencing 198 souls to death at 32,000 feet. Both engines dead. Nearest runway 80 miles beyond their glide range. Forest below waiting to consume them. Then a woman in hiking boots stood up from seat 19B and said 4 words that changed everything: "I can land this." Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737-800 carved through crystalline air at 32,000 feet, its twin engines humming with mechanical precision as Captain David Morrison reviewed the navigation display with practiced efficiency. Flight 2847 from Seattle to Minneapolis traced a route across some of North America's most remote wilderness, the vast unpopulated regions of northern Montana and North Dakota, where civilization disappeared beneath endless stretches of forest, mountain ranges, and desolate terrain that stretched to every horizon. "We're entering the Yaak River corridor," Morrison told his first officer, checking their position against the flight plan. "Next 30 minutes takes us over the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. 1.5 million acres of absolutely nothing." First Officer Jennifer Chen nodded, her fingers dancing across the flight management system as she confirmed their route. "Nearest suitable airport is Kalispell, 140 miles behind us. Great Falls is 240 miles ahead. We're in the geographical sweet spot where emergency options just don't exist." Morrison had flown this route dozens of times over his 27-year career, and the remote wilderness corridor never failed to inspire both awe and discomfort. Below them spread terrain so hostile and unpopulated that even small aircraft avoided it when possible, dense old-growth forests blanketing mountainsides, razor-edged peaks jutting toward the stratosphere, valleys so deep and narrow that sunlight barely penetrated to their floors. If something went catastrophically wrong during these 30 minutes, they would be gliding toward terrain that offered no mercy, no clearings large enough for emergency landings, no civilization to provide immediate rescue. "Air Traffic Control, Flight 2847, Morrison transmitted, his voice carrying the professional calm that passengers found reassuring. "Confirming position over waypoint YAAK, entering extended wilderness corridor. Fuel normal, all systems green." "Flight 2847, Seattle Center," the controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "Copy your position. Be advised you're entering approximately 280 miles of continuous wilderness terrain with no emergency landing facilities. Nearest diversion airports are Kalispell at 140 miles behind you and Great Falls at 240 miles ahead. Missoula is 190 miles south-southeast but across significant mountain terrain. Weather remains clear, winds light. We'll maintain close monitoring." "Appreciate that, Center," Morrison replied, settling back in his seat with the comfort of routine. Behind him, 198 passengers occupied the cabin, business travelers heading home, families visiting relatives, outdoor enthusiasts planning wilderness adventures in the northern Rockies. Most dozed or read or stared at entertainment screens, unaware that their flight path currently traced across terrain so remote that even highway infrastructure didn't exist for hundreds of square miles in any direction. In seat 19B, Sarah Chen, no relation to the first officer despite sharing a surname, gazed out the window at the wilderness below with eyes that saw details other passengers missed. Her weathered hiking boots rested against the seat in front of her, worn leather testifying to countless miles across difficult terrain. Her practical Gore-Tex jacket, faded from sun exposure, hung in the overhead compartment. To casual observers, she appeared to be just another outdoor enthusiast heading toward Montana's recreational opportunities, perhaps planning hiking trips or wildlife photography expeditions in the northern wilderness. The passenger beside her, a chatty sales representative from Portland, had spent the first hour of the flight discussing his weekend plans. "You look like you know the outdoors," he'd observed, noting her practical clothing and the topographical maps visible in her carry-on. "Going camping or something?" "Something like that," Sarah had replied with a noncommittal smile, offering no details about her background, no hint that the wilderness terrain passing beneath them represented not recreation but her former profession. The conversation had drifted to hiking trails and wildlife viewing before her seatmate had dozed off, leaving Sarah to her thoughts and the view outside her window. What she saw through that small oval of reinforced glass was terrain she understood with intimate professional knowledge, the dense forests that from this altitude appeared as unbroken green carpet, the mountain valleys carved by ancient glaciers, the river system snaking through wilderness so remote that even experienced outdoorsmen ventured there rarely. She recognized the Bob Marshall Wilderness from aerial perspective, having flown over and occasionally into its edges during her career, though never in an aircraft remotely comparable to this commercial Boeing. 23 years she'd spent as a bush pilot, wilderness aviation specialist, and remote area operations expert before retiring 6 months ago to pursue less demanding work as an outdoor recreation consultant. 23 years of landing aircraft on surfaces that would terrify conventional pilots, frozen lakes where ice thickness determined survival, river sandbars where approach angles meant the difference between controlled landing and catastrophic crash, mountain meadows so short that precise speed management became absolutely critical, desert playas where surface hardness could only be assessed through visual analysis and hard-won experience. She'd accumulated over 4,000 hours of flight time in wilderness conditions, operating single-engine Cessnas and de Havilland Beavers and Piper Cubs in regions where the nearest airport might be 200 miles away and weather could transform from clear to lethal within minutes. She'd landed on surfaces that existed nowhere in commercial aviation training manuals, gravel bars, tundra, beach sand, high-altitude meadows above treeline where thin air turned normal approaches into calculated gambles. She'd pioneered techniques for assessing unprepared landing surfaces from altitude, developed protocols for emergency terrain landings that bush pilot communities shared but which conventional aviation largely ignored because commercial operations simply never required such knowledge. Her career had taken her across Alaska's interior, northern Canada's remote territories, Montana's wilderness regions, and other places where civilization ended and self-reliance began. She'd executed successful emergency landings on improvised surfaces dozens of times when mechanical failures or weather forced her down in hostile terrain. She'd survived situations that killed less experienced wilderness pilots because her knowledge extended beyond mere flying skill to encompass terrain assessment, surface characteristics, obstacle evaluation, and the technical reality that almost any terrain could be landed on successfully if the pilot possessed sufficient expertise and maintained absolute focus during execution. But she'd never mentioned any of this to her seatmate, never revealed that the outdoor clothing she wore represented professional attire from her former career rather than recreational costume. Most people found bush pilot stories either unbelievable or unsettling, and Sarah had learned long ago that casual conversation rarely benefited from detailed descriptions of landing aircraft on frozen rivers or calculating whether mountain meadows offered sufficient length before committing to approaches where go-arounds became impossible. So she sat quietly in 19B, watching wilderness terrain slide past below, remembering hundreds of landings on surfaces that conventional wisdom declared unsurvivable, carrying knowledge that existed outside mainstream aviation training but which represented her entire professional identity for over 2 decades. The aircraft droned onward through clear skies, its engines maintaining steady thrust, its systems functioning within normal parameters, its crew confident in the routine nature of this flight segment despite the hostile terrain below. Morrison and Chen in the cockpit monitored instruments with practiced efficiency, noting fuel consumption, checking navigation waypoints, maintaining communication with air traffic control as they progressed across the wilderness corridor toward eventually re-emerging over populated regions where airports existed at reasonable intervals. Then everything changed in the span of 3 seconds. The first indication came as a massive shudder that transmitted through the entire airframe, a violent vibration that snapped Morrison's attention to his engine instruments even as the aircraft pitched slightly nose-down from sudden thrust asymmetry. The left engine's parameters spiked wildly, exhaust gas temperature redlining, turbine speed oscillating, oil pressure dropping towards zero as catastrophic mechanical failure destroyed internal components with explosive force. Engine failure, left side. Chen called out, her hands already reaching for emergency procedures as training took over. I've got massive parameter deviations across. She never finished the sentence because the right engine failed simultaneously, its instruments displaying the same catastrophic collapse as metal components that had functioned flawlessly for thousands of hours suddenly disintegrated under stresses they were designed to withstand. Both turbines seized within seconds of each other, their destruction so complete and synchronized that Morrison's mind struggled to process the impossible reality even as his hands moved through emergency restart procedures with automatic precision. The sound changed instantly from the steady hum of powered flight to the eerie whistling silence of a powerless glider. Without thrust from its engines, the massive Boeing became nothing more than an aerodynamic shape falling through the atmosphere, its glide characteristics determined by physics rather than pilot control, its fate tied directly to mathematics that Morrison calculated with mounting horror. Both engines failed. His voice carried shock that professional training couldn't quite suppress. Attempting restart procedures. Jennifer, give me APU start, get auxiliary power online now. Chen's fingers flew across switches and buttons, bringing the auxiliary power unit online to maintain electrical systems and hydraulics while Morrison worked through the dual-engine failure checklist that existed in training manuals but which pilots prayed they'd never need in actual flight. His hands moved from ignition switches to fuel system controls, attempting to restart engines that showed zero response to emergency procedures. Ignition attempts negative on both engines, Morrison reported, his voice tightening as seconds ticked past without the blessed sound of turbines spooling back to life. Fuel flow shows normal but I'm getting no ignition, no spool up, nothing. These engines are completely dead. Seattle Center, Flight 2847, declaring emergency. Chen transmitted, her professional composure cracking slightly under the reality of their situation. We have dual engine failure, both engines unresponsive to restart attempts. We are gliding, 31,500 feet, need immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. The controller's response came with barely controlled urgency, Flight 2847, copy your emergency. Nearest airport is Great Falls at 240 miles, bearing 085 degrees. Kalispell is 145 miles behind you, bearing 260 degrees. Missoula is 190 miles, bearing 175 but across significant mountain terrain. What is your glide range from current altitude? Morrison's mind performed calculations with desperate speed, his years of experience providing numbers even as he continued futile restart attempts on engines that refused to respond. A Boeing 737-800 at 31,000 feet, configured for optimal glide with proper speed management, could theoretically achieve a glide ratio of approximately 17:1, meaning 17 miles forward for every mile of altitude lost. From their current height of roughly 6 miles above terrain, that provided maximum glide range of approximately 100 miles. But that assumed perfect conditions, optimal configuration, no wind penalty, and terrain at sea level. The wilderness below them averaged 6,000 feet elevation, reducing their effective altitude by more than a mile. Mountains ahead rose even higher, some peaks jutting to 10,000 feet or more. Headwinds at altitude would further reduce ground distance covered. The real-world glide range would be significantly less than theoretical maximum. Our glide range is approximately 160 miles under optimal conditions, Morrison transmitted, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. But we're over elevated terrain, facing headwind component, and will lose range crossing mountain ridges. Great Falls is 80 miles beyond our maximum reach even with perfect glide management. Silence filled the frequency for 3 seconds that felt like hours before the controller responded, Flight 2847, understand you cannot reach Great Falls. Kalispell is also beyond your glide range. I'm searching databases for any emergency landing facilities within your reach. Stand by. Morrison continued restart attempts while his mind raced through options that didn't exist. Chen scanned the terrain below with increasing desperation, seeing nothing but wilderness, endless forests, jagged mountains, deep valleys that would tear the aircraft apart if they attempted landing in such hostile terrain. The aircraft descended in eerie silence except for wind noise, losing altitude at approximately 1,500 feet per minute, gliding toward Earth with mathematical certainty while its pilots struggled to find any solution to the impossible equation they faced. Seattle Center, Flight 2847, Morrison transmitted after checking every system, attempting every restart procedure, exhausting every technical option. Engines remain unresponsive. We've tried everything. What emergency facilities do you have within 160 miles of our current position? The controller's voice carried the weight of delivering information that condemned everyone aboard. Flight 2847, I have searched all databases. There are no airports, no airstrips, no emergency landing facilities of any kind within your glide range. The nearest paved runway is Kalispell at 145 miles, which you cannot reach. There are some private airstrips in mountain valleys but none within your range, and most are too short for aircraft your size. The terrain below you is continuous wilderness with no suitable landing sites visible on satellite imagery. I'm sorry, 2847. I don't have good options to give you. Morrison stared at his instruments, watching altitude bleed away, 30,000 feet now, descending steadily, the aircraft responding normally to control inputs but without power to arrest the descent or extend their range beyond what physics dictated. His 27 years of experience, his thousands of hours in cockpits, his extensive training in emergency procedures, none of it mattered because mathematics and geography had conspired to create a situation where skill couldn't overcome the simple brutal reality that they couldn't glide far enough to reach any runway. He looked at Chen, saw his own horror reflected in her face. He looked at the terrain below, seeing nothing but death. Dense forests would tear the fuselage apart on impact. Mountain slopes would send them cartwheeling to destruction. Valley floors offered no clearings large enough for a commercial aircraft. The wilderness that looked beautiful from altitude would become their graveyard because commercial aviation training had never prepared him for landing on unprepared surfaces. His entire career involved runways, prepared landing areas, infrastructure that the terrain below simply didn't provide. Jennifer, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of accepting failure. I need you to calculate our impact point based on current glide angle. Then I need you to help me prepare for crash landing procedures. We're going down in wilderness terrain, and I don't see any way to make this survivable. Chen's hands trembled as she worked the navigation computer, plotting their descent path against terrain elevation, calculating where their glide would end based on current descent rate and ground speed. Based on present glide angle, we'll impact terrain in approximately 23 minutes, she reported, her voice breaking slightly. Impact point will be in the Mission Mountain Wilderness, heavily forested terrain at approximately 7,000 feet elevation. David, there's nothing there. Just trees and mountains. I don't see how anyone survives landing in that. Morrison nodded slowly, his mind cycling through scenarios that all ended the same way: catastrophic structural failure when the aircraft impacted forest or mountainside, the fuselage breaking apart, fire from ruptured fuel tanks, casualties that would make this one of the worst aviation disasters in recent history. He'd read accident reports, studied crash investigations, understood exactly what happened when large aircraft attempted landings in terrain unsuitable for aviation operations. He reached for the passenger address system, his hand steady despite the churning in his gut. This was his responsibility, his burden to carry. The passengers deserved honesty about what faced them, deserved time to make peace with family through phone calls, deserved to know that their captain had exhausted every option before admitting defeat. The chime sounded through the cabin, instantly capturing attention from passengers who had been reading or sleeping or watching movies, unaware that anything was wrong until that ominous sound preceded their captain's announcement. Morrison took a breath, gathering words for a message he'd never imagined delivering, information that would shatter 198 lives with the finality of physics denying mercy. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. His voice carried through the cabin speakers with barely controlled emotion that passengers immediately recognized as wrong, as terrifying in its departure from the calm professional tone they'd heard during routine announcements earlier in the flight. We have experienced catastrophic failure of both engines. My crew and I have attempted every restart procedure without success. The engines cannot be restarted. He paused, forcing himself to continue with information that felt like pronouncing death sentences. We are currently gliding at 30,000 feet. We have contacted air traffic control for emergency landing options. The nearest suitable airport is 240 miles away. Our maximum glide range is approximately 160 miles. We cannot reach any airport or prepared runway. Gasps and cries of shock rippled through the cabin as passengers processed information their minds struggled to accept. Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of a professional pilot admitting he'd been defeated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. I have calculated our options. I have searched for alternatives. I have exhausted every emergency procedure in my training and experience. We will be attempting emergency landing in wilderness terrain below us. The terrain is heavily forested mountains with no clearings suitable for aircraft landings. I need to be honest with you about our situation. I don't have solutions. I don't have good options. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. His voice broke on the final words, professional composure crumbling under the weight of failure that felt personal despite being pure mathematical reality. Flight attendants, begin preparing cabin for emergency landing. Passengers, please follow crew instructions carefully. Call your families if you're able. I'm sorry I can't give you better news. I've failed you, and I'm sorry. The announcement ended, leaving the cabin in stunned silence for approximately 3 seconds before panic erupted, screams, crying, passengers desperately reaching for phones to make final calls to loved ones, parents clutching children, the raw terror of people who just learned they would die within the next 20 minutes because physics had placed them beyond reach of safety. In the cockpit, Morrison slumped in his seat with the resignation of someone who'd accepted failure as inevitable. He continued monitoring instruments with mechanical efficiency, maintaining optimal glide speed, pointing the aircraft toward terrain that would kill them regardless of his skill because wilderness didn't forgive and mountains didn't offer mercy. Chen attempted to encourage alternative approaches, suggesting river valleys or clearings that might provide landing opportunities, but even as she spoke they both knew she was grasping at impossibilities. There's nothing down there suitable for landing this aircraft, Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the emptiness of defeated certainty. Forest will tear us apart. Mountains will destroy the fuselage. Even if we find a valley or clearing, the terrain is too rough, too short, too obstacle-filled for a Boeing to survive landing. Commercial aircraft need prepared runways, Jennifer. They need smooth surfaces, adequate length, infrastructure. We're gliding toward terrain that offers none of those things, and I don't know how to land in wilderness because my training never covered it. Bush pilots operate in terrain like this, but I'm not a bush pilot. I'm a commercial pilot, and commercial pilots need airports. We don't have one, so we're going to crash. He stared at the navigation display, watching their glide path intersect with terrain elevation in approximately 21 minutes now, seeing the countdown to impact displayed with digital precision. His mind cycled through final responsibilities, ensuring passengers had time for goodbye calls, coordinating with flight attendants for crash positions, selecting the least lethal impact point possible even though all options looked equally fatal from altitude. 27 years of flying, thousands of hours in command, an exemplary safety record, and none of it mattered because he'd never learned wilderness aviation operations. He could fly commercial aircraft with precision that bordered on artistry, but landing on unprepared surfaces in hostile terrain was specialized knowledge that bush pilots possessed and commercial training never covered. His expertise ended where runways ended, and the wilderness below represented the termination of his capabilities. In the cabin, Sarah Chen sat frozen in 19B, her mind processing the captain's announcement with rapidly escalating certainty that she possessed information capable of changing this situation's outcome. Her seatmate was crying openly now, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke desperately to someone, wife, girlfriend, family member, delivering final words that assumed death was inevitable because the captain had declared it so. But Sarah's wilderness aviation expertise provided different analysis of their situation. Her eyes tracked the terrain below with professional assessment, her mind calculating glide range against geographical features, her knowledge identifying potential landing sites that the captain's commercial training wouldn't recognize as viable because they existed outside runway-based aviation operations. She could see what Morrison couldn't, that wilderness terrain wasn't automatically fatal, that forests occasionally gave way to river valleys with exposed surfaces, that mountain wilderness contained hidden landing opportunities if you possessed the knowledge to identify them. She'd spent 23 years learning exactly what the captain had just admitted he didn't know: how to assess wilderness terrain for emergency landing viability, how to execute approaches on unprepared surfaces, how to land aircraft where conventional wisdom said landing was impossible. The captain's resignation announcement echoed in her mind: I don't know how to land in wilderness because my training never covered it. Bush pilots operate in terrain like this, but I'm not a bush pilot. She was exactly what he wasn't. Her entire career had been wilderness operations, off-airport landings, remote terrain aviation where survival depended on capabilities that commercial flying never developed. The captain viewed the wilderness below as an execution ground because his training taught him that aircraft required prepared runways. Her training taught her that nearly any terrain could serve as a landing surface if the pilot possessed sufficient expertise and properly assessed approach options. Morrison had surrendered because conventional knowledge said they would die. Sarah's unconventional knowledge said they might survive if someone who understood wilderness landing techniques took control. She unbuckled her seatbelt with decisive motion, her mind already shifting into the focused state that wilderness emergencies demanded: absolute clarity of thought, complete confidence in technical knowledge, unwavering commitment to execution despite apparent impossibility. Around her, passengers wept or prayed or made frantic phone calls, consumed by terror that their captain had validated as reasonable. Sarah moved through the chaos with calm purpose that contrasted sharply with surrounding despair, her hiking boots finding secure footing as the aircraft continued its silent glide toward terrain that everyone aboard assumed would be their grave. A flight attendant caught her arm as she moved toward the forward cabin. "Ma'am, please return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We're in emergency situation." "I'm a wilderness aviation specialist," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying authority that stopped the attendant's objection. "Former Bush pilot with 23 years experience landing aircraft in remote terrain. The captain just announced he doesn't know wilderness landing procedures." "I do. I need to reach the cockpit immediately." The attendant stared at her, struggling to process this information while passengers around them screamed or sobbed. Sarah didn't wait for permission, instead continuing forward through the cabin with single-minded determination. Another flight attendant attempted to block her path near row 8, and Sarah repeated her credentials with additional detail: "My name is Sarah Chin. I hold commercial pilot certification with wilderness operations endorsement. I've logged over 4,000 hours in bush aircraft with more than 400 off-airport landings in unprepared terrain. I can land this aircraft if the captain gives me control. Let me through now, or everyone dies," because the qualified person stayed in her seat. The rawness of that statement, delivered with absolute conviction, convinced the flight attendant to step aside. Sarah reached the forward galley and knocked firmly on the cockpit door while announcing through the intercom, "Cockpit, this is passenger Sarah Chin requesting immediate access. I'm a former Bush pilot with wilderness landing expertise. The captain needs to hear what I have to say before we run out of altitude." Morrison's voice came through the intercom, heavy with resignation: "Ma'am, please return to your seat. There's nothing you can do to help." "Captain, I've spent 23 years landing aircraft on frozen lakes, river sandbars, desert flats, and mountain meadows," Sarah replied, her voice carrying through the door with intensity born from absolute certainty that she possessed critical knowledge. "I've executed over 400 wilderness landings on unprepared surfaces during my career in remote regions. The terrain below isn't a death sentence to pilots who know wilderness aviation operations. Let me in, and I will help you find a landing site." Silence filled the seconds after her statement, stretching long enough that Sarah wondered if Morrison would refuse. Then she heard locks disengaging and the cockpit door swung inward, revealing Morrison and Chen at their stations, their faces showing shock at her claims but also desperate hope that maybe, impossibly, someone aboard possessed the specialized knowledge their situation demanded. Sarah stepped into the flight deck, her eyes immediately scanning instruments with the practiced efficiency of someone whose flying career involved constant emergency assessment. She noted their altitude, 28,000 feet now, their descent rate, their ground speed, the navigation display showing terrain ahead. Her mind performed calculations that combined commercial aviation principles with wilderness operations expertise, determining glide range, identifying geographical features within reach, assessing landing viability of terrain that Morrison viewed as uniformly fatal. Morrison stared at her outdoor clothing, her hiking boots, the casual recreational appearance that seemed completely incongruous with the professional aviation knowledge she claimed. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone carrying both skepticism and desperate hope. "Sarah Chen, former bush pilot and wilderness aviation specialist," she replied, her attention divided between Morrison and the terrain visible through the windscreen. "I spent 2 decades flying remote operations in Alaska, northern Canada, and Montana wilderness. I hold commercial pilot certification with over 4,000 hours, including extensive experience in off-airport operations, emergency terrain landings, and wilderness survival situations. I'm currently working as an outdoor recreation consultant, but wilderness aviation was my career and my expertise for 23 years. She moved closer to the center console, her eyes tracking the navigation display. From 28,000 feet, we have approximately 22 minutes before terrain impact based on current descent rate. The captain's right that we can't reach prepared airports. But prepared airports aren't our only option if we're willing to consider landing surfaces that commercial aviation doesn't normally use. Morrison shook his head, his expression mixing disbelief with defensive rejection of hope he'd already abandoned. Landing on wilderness terrain means catastrophic crash. Forest will destroy the aircraft. Mountain slopes will tear the fuselage apart. I don't see options that don't kill most people aboard. Because your training taught you to think in terms of prepared runways and conventional landing surfaces, Sarah replied, her voice firm but not unkind. Bush pilot training teaches different assessment criteria. Wilderness terrain contains landing opportunities that runway-trained pilots don't recognize as viable. I need to assess what's within our glide range. Give me access to satellite imagery or topographical data for terrain ahead. Chen was already pulling up enhanced terrain displays, her skepticism warring with desperate willingness to consider any alternative to the crash landing Morrison had accepted as inevitable. We're currently over the Bob Marshall Wilderness, she reported. Continuous forest and mountain terrain for approximately 100 miles in all directions. I don't see clearings large enough for aircraft this size. Sarah leaned over the navigation display, her experienced eyes analyzing terrain with assessment criteria that existed outside standard aviation training. She was looking for features that commercial pilots didn't recognize as potential landing sites: river valleys where seasonal water recession might expose sandbars, mountain meadows above treeline that could provide approach space, geological formations that created natural flats in otherwise hostile terrain. Seattle Center, this is Flight 2847, Morrison transmitted, his voice still carrying defeat but with slight undertone of fragile hope. We have a passenger aboard claiming wilderness aviation expertise. Sarah Chen, former bush pilot. She's requesting access to detailed terrain data within our glide range. Can you provide satellite imagery or topographical analysis of potential landing sites? The controller's response came with barely controlled surprise. Flight 2847, say again. You have a bush pilot passenger? Affirmative, Center, Morrison replied. She claims over 4,000 hours flying remote operations with extensive experience in off-airport landings. I'm willing to listen to anyone who might have knowledge I don't possess. Stand by, 2847, the controller replied, his tone shifting from resigned tragedy to active problem-solving. I'm conferencing with our emergency operations team and pulling enhanced satellite data for your area. Give me 2 minutes. Sarah used those 2 minutes to provide Morrison with rapid technical demonstration of her wilderness aviation credentials. Commercial training teaches you that aircraft need smooth prepared runways, minimal obstacles, adequate length calculated precisely. Wilderness training teaches that almost any terrain can work if you understand surface characteristics, approach geometry, and acceptable damage tolerances. I've landed Beavers and Cessnas on surfaces that would horrify commercial pilots, gravel bars where larger rocks meant careful steering during rollout, frozen lakes where ice thickness determined whether I broke through or completed landing safely, mountain meadows so short that I was committed to landing the moment I descended below Treeline because go-arounds became impossible. She pointed at the terrain display. This aircraft is larger and heavier than anything I flew during my career, but the principles remain identical. I need to identify terrain with specific characteristics, sufficient length for our approach speed, surface composition that provides adequate friction without immediately destroying landing gear, approach angles that work with our glide slope, and obstacle clearance that allows controlled descent rather than catastrophic collision. Those criteria eliminate most wilderness terrain, but not all of it. Morrison listened with the desperate attention of someone drowning who'd just glimpsed a life preserver, his professional skepticism eroding under the technical precision of Sarah's explanation. You're saying you can assess wilderness terrain and determine landing viability from altitude? That's exactly what bush pilots do every time we operate in remote regions, Sarah confirmed. Landing at prepared airports means following published procedures and established criteria. Landing in wilderness means real-time assessment of unprepared surfaces using knowledge developed through experience that most pilots never acquire because commercial operations don't require it. I've survived by developing that knowledge. I can apply it now if you're willing to relinquish control and trust unconventional expertise. Chen interrupted with urgent information. Seattle Center is transmitting enhanced terrain data now. They've also confirmed Sarah Chen's pilot credentials through FAA databases. She holds commercial certification with Wilderness Operations Endorsement, over 4,000 hours logged, including extensive off-airport operations throughout Alaska and Northern Territories. Her credentials are legitimate. Morrison turned to Sarah with expression that combined lingering doubt and desperate willingness to believe that maybe, impossibly, someone aboard possessed exactly the specialized knowledge their situation demanded. If I give you control, what happens? What's your plan? My plan is to identify a landing site within our glide range that meets wilderness landing criteria, Sarah replied, moving to the captain's seat with Morrison's unspoken permission. I'm looking for specific terrain features, river valleys with exposed sandbars from seasonal water recession, mountain meadows above treeline that provide natural clearings, geological formations that create flat areas in otherwise rough terrain. I'll assess surface characteristics visually, calculate approach geometry based on our glide slope, and execute landing using techniques that maximize survival probability even if aircraft damage is severe. She settled into the captain's seat with hands that remembered this responsibility from thousands of hours in cockpit command, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead through the windscreen while her peripheral vision monitored instruments. Morrison remained standing beside her, prepared to resume control if her claims proved false but increasingly willing to believe that maybe wilderness expertise offered hope where commercial training found only despair. The enhanced terrain data appeared on the navigation display, high-resolution satellite imagery showing details invisible to standard navigation charts. Sarah's eyes tracked the display with practiced efficiency, dismissing terrain that looked viable to untrained observers but which her experience identified as lethal, forests too dense for controlled landing, mountain slopes too steep for approach management, valley floors too obstacle-filled for aircraft survival. Then she saw it. There, she said, her finger indicating a location on the display approximately 80 miles ahead along their glide path. That river valley on the Mission River's West Fork. See that exposed sandbar on the inside bend? Recent satellite pass shows approximately 3/4 of a mile of exposed surface where seasonal runoff has receded, leaving packed sand. Morrison stared at the imagery, seeing only a narrow strip of questionable surface surrounded by forest and mountains. That's a sandbar. We can't land a Boeing 737 on a sandbar. The surface will be too soft, too unstable. The landing gear will sink or collapse. We'll cartwheel and break apart. Packed sandbars provide better surface characteristics than most people understand, Sarah countered, her voice carrying confidence born from direct experience. I've landed on dozens of river sandbars during my career. Recent water recession leaves compacted sand that's been compressed by flowing water, it's not beach sand that footprints sink into. The surface characteristics suggest adequate load-bearing capacity for controlled landing if we manage touchdown speed properly and distribute weight across maximum surface area. She pointed at specific features visible in the satellite imagery. The sandbar length is approximately 3/4 mile with relatively consistent width of maybe 200 feet at the widest point. The approach angle works with our glide slope. We'll come in along the river valley from the south-southeast, using the valley walls as natural approach corridor. The sandbar surface shows minimal large obstacles based on visual analysis. The touchdown zone has slight upslope that will help decelerate us naturally once we're down. The trees, Chen interjected, pointing at forest encroaching on both sides of the sandbar. We'll have no margin for error. If we drift off the sandbar laterally, we hit forest and die. Correct, Sarah acknowledged without hesitation. This is not a forgiving landing site by commercial standards. It requires precise speed management, exact centerline alignment, and committed execution once we're below valley walls because go-around becomes impossible. But it's survivable with proper technique. Forest impact is fatal. Controlled landing on that sandbar gives us a chance. That's better than certain death, which is what we're currently gliding toward. Morrison stared at the imagery, his mind struggling with decision that violated every instinct his commercial training had developed while simultaneously offering the only alternative to resignation he'd already accepted. His eyes met Sarah's, seeing absolute confidence in her expression, professional certainty that existed beyond bravado or false hope. "You're absolutely certain you can execute this landing?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of 198 lives depending on her answer. "I'm certain that I have significantly higher probability of successful execution than anyone else aboard this aircraft," Sarah replied, her honesty refusing to claim certainty where wilderness operations never provided guarantees. "I've landed on worse surfaces in more hostile conditions. I know wilderness landing technique. I understand off-airport operations. I'm not guaranteeing survival, Captain. I'm offering expertise that gives us the best chance we're going to get, which is infinitely better than guaranteed death from crash landing in forest." The aircraft descended through 26,000 feet now, gliding inexorably toward terrain while Morrison wrestled with decision that felt both insane and necessary. Every particle of his commercial training screamed that relinquishing control to a passenger was madness, that landing on a river sandbar meant catastrophic crash, that trusting unconventional expertise was desperate foolishness. But his calculations proved they were dying anyway under conventional assessment, and this passenger's credentials verified through FAA databases confirmed she possessed specialized knowledge his training lacked. Sometimes survival demanded trust in expertise that existed outside comfortable familiarity. "All right," Morrison said, the words feeling like surrender and hope simultaneously. "You have control. I'm trusting your wilderness expertise because conventional options don't exist. But I'm staying right here, and if anything looks wrong, I'm taking control back immediately." Sarah nodded acceptance of those terms, her hands settling onto the control yoke with the familiar weight of command she'd carried for thousands of hours in wilderness cockpits. "I have control," she confirmed, her voice carrying calm authority. "Seattle Center, Flight 2847. We've identified potential landing site at Mission River West Fork, approximately 80 miles ahead. Exposed sandbar showing on satellite imagery. Request you transmit all available detail on that location, surface characteristics, obstacle clearance, wind conditions, anything that might affect approach and landing." "Flight 2847, Seattle Center," the controller replied, his tone mixing amazement and desperate hope. "We're analyzing that location now. Stand by for data. I'm also notifying search and rescue to preposition assets near that area in case this works." Sarah adjusted their glide path slightly, optimizing their trajectory toward the identified landing site while maintaining speed that balanced maximum glide distance against need for controllable approach velocity when they reached the sandbar. She coordinated with Chen to configure the aircraft properly. Flaps and landing gear would remain retracted until final approach to minimize drag and maximize glide range, then would be deployed carefully to manage touchdown speed without sacrificing precious altitude unnecessarily. Captain Morrison, I need you to help me with some tasks, Sarah said, her attention divided between terrain ahead and instrument monitoring. I'll handle flying and navigation. I need you to manage systems, coordinate with air traffic control, and monitor our descent profile. First Officer Chen, I need you to calculate precise glide range continuously so I know if we need to adjust approach or if we're on track. This is still a crew operation, I'm just the one who knows wilderness landing technique. Morrison moved to the first officer's station, taking over system management while Chen focused on navigation calculations. The cockpit settled into focused cooperation as three professionals combined their expertise toward a goal that seemed impossible but represented their only chance. The terrain ahead revealed itself with increasing detail as they descended, the endless forests Morrison had viewed as execution ground, the mountain ranges jutting toward the sky, the river systems carving through wilderness with geological patience. Sarah's eyes tracked the Mission River's path through the landscape, identifying the West Fork where her selected sandbar awaited, assessing approach geometry with practiced efficiency. Talk me through your landing plan, Morrison requested, his need to understand overcoming his uncertainty about trusting passenger expertise. I want to know exactly what you're going to do. Sarah kept her eyes on the terrain while explaining her technique. We're currently at 24,000 feet, approximately 70 miles from the landing site. At present descent rate, we'll reach the Mission River Valley at approximately 4,000 feet above the sandbar elevation. That gives us enough altitude to set up proper approach without overshooting and sufficient height to assess final conditions before committing. The approach will be visual flight rules because we don't have instrument approach for a sandbar, she continued, her tone carrying the matter-of-fact practicality of someone describing routine procedures despite the extraordinary nature of their situation. I'll use the river valley as natural approach corridor, descending along the valley walls to maintain controlled glide slope. The sandbar runs roughly north-south, so we'll approach from the south-southeast, landing toward the north-northwest. Final approach will be configured with full flaps and landing gear deployed approximately 2 miles from touchdown to manage speed without excessive sink rate. I'm targeting touchdown speed of approximately 130 knots, faster than optimal for runway landing but necessary because we can't afford to stall given our limited altitude and no go-around capability once we're committed. Touchdown will be long and flat, making contact with main gear and nose gear nearly simultaneously to maximize surface contact area and distribute impact forces. We'll use the full length of available sandbar for rollout because braking on unprepared surface is unpredictable. Expect rough landing, significant noise from gear stress, possible structural damage to lower fuselage and landing gear assemblies. But if executed properly, the fuselage will remain intact and occupants will survive. Morrison listened with the focused intensity of someone hearing technical details that his training never covered but which his desperate situation forced him to accept as their only hope. What happens if the surface is softer than you're expecting? If the landing gear sinks or collapses? Then we'll have a rough landing that becomes significantly rougher, Sarah replied honestly. Her refusal to sugarcoat risks evidence of professional respect for Morrison's intelligence. Landing gear collapse means fuselage contact with surface, increased deceleration forces, higher probability of injury to occupants. But even landing gear collapse is survivable if the fuselage remains structurally sound. What kills people is catastrophic breakup from forest impact or uncontrolled collision with obstacles. Controlled landing on questionable surface where gear might collapse still gives occupants chance of survival. That's the critical distinction. Chen interrupted with updated calculation. Current descent profile puts us at 4,500 feet above terrain when we reach the valley entrance. That gives us some margin for approach adjustment. Good, Sarah acknowledged, her hands making minor control inputs to optimize their glide path. Seattle Center, Flight 2847. What's the wind situation at our landing site? Flight 2847, surface winds at Mission River West Fork showing light and variable, estimated 5 to 10 knots from the northwest, the controller reported, his voice carrying barely controlled tension. Satellite analysis confirms sandbar surface as described. We're seeing approximately 4,500 feet of exposed sand on the inside river bend, width varying from 150 to 220 feet. Surface appears relatively smooth with no major obstacles visible on current imagery. But I have to emphasize, 2,847, this is completely unverified terrain. We have no ground truth about surface hardness, hidden obstacles, or landing viability. You're committing to approach based on satellite data that can't tell us if that surface will support aircraft weight. Understood, Center, Sarah replied calmly. That's exactly how wilderness landings work. You assess from available data, you apply experience-based judgment, and you execute with commitment because uncertainty is part of wilderness operations. I've landed on hundreds of surfaces without ground truth verification. It's part of bush pilot operations. She glanced at Morrison, seeing the conflict in his expression, commercial training that screamed this was madness warring with desperate hope that wilderness expertise might save them. Captain, I need you to make cabin announcement explaining our landing plan. Passengers deserve to know we've identified a landing site and that someone with wilderness aviation expertise is executing the approach. They need to understand this will be rough but survivable if executed properly. Morrison nodded slowly, reaching for the passenger address system while watching Sarah manage the gliding aircraft with competence that eased some of his doubt. He keyed the microphone, and his voice filled the cabin with message dramatically different from the resignation passengers had heard in his previous announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison with an update on our situation. His tone carried controlled hope that passengers immediately recognized as changed from earlier despair. We have identified a potential landing site, an exposed river sandbar approximately 70 miles ahead within our glide range. More importantly, we have discovered that one of our passengers, Sarah Chen, is a former bush pilot with over 23 years of wilderness aviation experience, including hundreds of landings on unprepared surfaces in remote terrain. He paused, letting that information sink in before continuing. Sarah has volunteered to execute the landing because her wilderness expertise specifically prepares her for exactly this type of operation. Her credentials have been verified through FAA databases, and she is currently at the controls. I want to be honest, this will not be a smooth landing. We're landing on an unprepared sandbar surface that will be rough and potentially damaging to the aircraft. But Sarah's expertise gives us a chance at survival that we didn't have before. Flight attendants, prepare cabin for rough terrain landing. Brace positions will be critical. Passengers, follow crew instructions exactly. We have approximately 18 minutes until landing. The cabin atmosphere transformed from despairing acceptance of death to tense hope mixed with continued fear. Passengers who've been making final goodbye calls now clung to that message of possibility, willing to believe that maybe the outdoor-dressed woman from seat 19B really did possess expertise capable of saving them from what their captain had previously declared inevitable fatality. Sarah heard Morrison's announcement through the cockpit speakers while maintaining focus on the terrain ahead. Through the windscreen, the Mission River Valley became visible as they descended through 20,000 feet, a dark line cutting through endless forest, mountains rising on either side, the specific sandbar still too distant to visualize but approaching with mathematical certainty as physics guided their powerless glide. 15 minutes to the valley entrance, Chen reported, monitoring their descent profile against navigation waypoints. We're on optimal glide path. Current altitude 20,000 feet, descent rate holding steady at 1,500 feet per minute. Sarah acknowledged the information while her mind ran through the approach sequence she'd execute dozens of times before on different terrain in smaller aircraft but never in anything as large as a Boeing 737. The principles remained identical: assess the surface, calculate approach geometry, commit to landing once below the point where go-around became impossible, manage speed to balance control against excessive energy at touchdown, accept rough landing as preferable to no landing. The wilderness aviation community had a saying that conventional pilots often found disturbing: any landing you walk away from is a good landing, and if the aircraft is reusable afterward, it's a great landing. Sarah had lived that philosophy for 23 years, executing landings that damaged aircraft but preserved lives, accepting bent metal and collapsed gear as acceptable outcomes when the alternative was avoiding the landing entirely and dying in the attempt. Today would test that philosophy with stakes higher than anything she'd previously faced. Her worst wilderness landing had involved 3 passengers in a Cessna 185, and everyone had walked away despite significant aircraft damage. Today she carried responsibility for 198 souls in an aircraft weighing 80 times more than anything she'd previously landed on unprepared surfaces. But the principles didn't change with scale. Physics worked the same whether landing a Cessna or a Boeing. Terrain assessment used identical criteria regardless of aircraft size. Execution required the same focus and commitment that she'd learned through thousands of hours in wilderness cockpits where mistakes meant death and hesitation killed you as surely as poor judgment. Captain Morrison, start coordinating with the flight attendants for final cabin preparations, Sarah directed, her voice steady despite the enormous responsibility she'd accepted. I need them to ensure everyone understands brace positions and that loose items are secured. This landing will be violent enough that anything not secured becomes a projectile. Also coordinate with Center for Emergency Response Positioning, we're going to need medical evacuation and rescue assets at that site immediately after landing. Morrison moved to implement her instructions, speaking rapidly with lead flight attendant through the interphone system while simultaneously coordinating with air traffic control for emergency response deployment. Search and rescue helicopters were already repositioning toward the Mission River area, ground teams mobilizing to reach the remote location, medical facilities in nearby towns preparing for mass casualty reception despite desperate hope that Sarah's expertise would minimize casualties. The aircraft descended through 15,000 feet, the wilderness below resolving into increasing detail as altitude decreased. Sarah could see individual trees now rather than undifferentiated forest carpet, could distinguish rock faces on mountain slopes, could identify specific features of the river system that contained her selected landing site. The Mission River carved through the landscape with the patient persistence of water eroding rock across geological timescales, creating valley walls that would serve as her approach corridor and sandbars that represented her landing surface. 10 minutes to valley entrance, Chen reported. Altitude 13,000 feet. We're slightly high on the glide path, do you want to increase descent rate? Negative, Sarah replied immediately. We maintain this glide profile. I'd rather arrive at the valley with excess altitude that I can bleed off during approach than arrive low with no margin for adjustment. Altitude is the one resource we can't replenish, so we conserve it carefully until final approach. She adjusted course slightly, fine-tuning their path toward the valley entrance while her eyes scanned the terrain with wilderness pilots' assessment criteria. The valley walls rose on either side of the river, creating natural approach corridor but also limiting maneuvering options once they descended below the ridgelines. Commercial pilots avoided such constrained approaches because they eliminated escape routes. If something went wrong during approach to the sandbar, the valley walls would prevent turning away toward alternative landing sites. But wilderness pilots understood that commitment to approach was inherent to remote operations. When landing on a mountain meadow or river sandbar, you committed to landing because alternatives didn't exist. The key was ensuring your initial assessment was accurate so that commitment didn't equal suicide. Sarah had made that calculation hundreds of times during her career, analyzing terrain, determining viability, committing to approach with full knowledge that aborting might be impossible. Her survival record testified to the accuracy of her assessments and the quality of her execution when commitment became absolute. Today's assessment said the sandbar was viable if approached correctly. Today's execution would determine whether 198 people lived or died based on the quality of her wilderness aviation expertise. Flight attendants report cabin prepared for emergency landing, Morrison informed her, his voice tight with tension. All passengers briefed on brace positions, loose items secured, evacuation procedures reviewed. Search and rescue confirms assets positioning toward landing site. Medical helicopters will be overhead within 20 minutes of our touchdown. Ground teams estimate 45 minutes to reach the site due to wilderness access difficulty. Acknowledged, Sarah replied, her focus absolute as they descended through 10,000 feet. The Mission River Valley entrance appeared ahead through the windscreen, the gap where mountains parted to allow the river passage, creating the natural corridor she would follow toward the sandbar that represented their only chance. 5 minutes to valley entrance, Chen called out, her voice carrying the tension of someone watching their lives depend on the expertise of a passenger none of them had known existed until 10 minutes ago. Altitude 8,000 feet. We're perfectly aligned with the valley approach. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, making minor adjustments to their glide path while her eyes tracked the valley with professional assessment. The river appeared as silver ribbon winding through forest, its course cutting south to north through terrain that looked beautiful from altitude but which would be instantly lethal if they impacted the forest canopy instead of successfully reaching the sandbar. "I'm beginning final approach sequence," Sarah announced, her voice carrying calm authority that helped settle Morrison's nerves despite his lingering doubts. "Deploying speed brakes to increase descent rate. We're committing to this approach now. Once we descend into the valley, we cannot turn back. The valley walls eliminate maneuvering options and the low altitude eliminates go-around capability. Everyone understand that this is full commitment from this point forward?" "Understood," Morrison confirmed, his throat tight. "We're with you, Sarah. Execute your landing." The aircraft descended into the valley entrance at 6,000 feet above terrain, the mountain walls rising on either side as they committed to the approach corridor that led toward the sandbar 8 miles ahead. Sarah deployed speed brakes carefully, increasing descent rate while maintaining controlled glide speed, descending into the valley with the commitment of someone who'd made similar approaches hundreds of times in smaller aircraft but never in anything with the weight and momentum of a commercial Boeing. The valley walls created optical illusion of increased speed as they passed close to rocky surfaces, the visual reference making their glide seem faster and more precarious than instrument readings indicated. Sarah ignored the illusion, trusting her instruments while using visual references to track their position relative to the river below. The sandbar should appear ahead at approximately 4 miles distance once they descended below the ridgeline that currently blocked direct view. 3,000 feet above terrain, Chen reported, her voice steady despite visible tension in her posture. "Ground speed 170 knots, descent rate 2,000 feet per minute. You're tracking centerline perfectly." Sarah acknowledged the information while her mind calculated approach geometry. They would reach the sandbar at approximately 1,500 feet above its surface, which provided adequate altitude for final configuration and controlled descent to touchdown. She would deploy landing gear and flaps at 2 miles from touchdown, bleeding off excess speed while maintaining controlled glide slope, committing to landing once they descended below 500 feet because at that altitude in this valley abort became physically impossible. Then she saw it, the sandbar appearing around the river bend ahead, exposed surface showing lighter color against the darker forest and river water, the irregular oval of packed sand that satellite imagery had revealed but which now appeared in direct visual assessment. Her wilderness pilot's eyes scanned the surface with practiced efficiency, noting features that would be invisible to untrained observers but which her experience identified as critical to landing viability. The surface showed consistent coloration suggesting uniform composition without patches of different material that might indicate soft spots or hidden obstacles. The sandbar's upstream edge showed clean definition where recent water recession had left distinct boundary, indicating that water level had dropped recently, exposing surface that had been underwater and therefore compressed by flowing water's weight. The approach end appeared relatively clear of large obstacles based on visual assessment from current distance and altitude. "I have visual on the landing site," Sarah announced, her voice carrying satisfaction that her satellite assessment matched reality. "Surface characteristics look viable. I'm committing to final approach." She deployed spoilers further to increase descent rate while simultaneously configuring the aircraft for landing, flaps extending to increase lift and drag, the whine of hydraulic actuators accompanying the mechanical deployment. The landing gear came down next, 3 distinct thumps resonating through the fuselage as main and nose gear locked into extended position, the drag from gear deployment slowing their forward speed while gravity continued pulling them toward the sandbar approaching rapidly ahead. "Landing gear down and locked," Chen confirmed, monitoring systems. Flaps at 30 degrees. Speed 140 knots and decreasing. Altitude 1,000 feet above landing surface. Sarah fine-tuned their approach path, making minor control inputs that kept them aligned with the sandbar centerline while managing descent rate to intercept the surface at the optimal touchdown point. The valley walls restricted lateral maneuvering to virtually nothing. They were committed to the centerline approach because deviation would put them into forest or mountainside with instantly fatal results. The sandbar rushed toward them with the accelerating perspective of final approach, details resolving as altitude decreased. Sarah could see the surface texture now, confirming her initial assessment that recent water recession had left packed sand rather than loose beach material. She could see where the upstream edge showed slight elevation difference, creating natural stopping area if their rollout extended to full sandbar length. She could see the width narrowing slightly at the touchdown zone before widening through the middle section, meaning she needed precise lateral control to avoid drifting off centerline into the forest that bordered the sand on both sides. 500 feet, Chen called out, her voice tight. Speed 130 knots. You're aligned perfectly. Sarah made final micro-adjustments to approach path, her hands steady on the controls as the sandbar filled her forward vision. This was the moment when wilderness aviation demanded absolute commitment. The altitude and confined valley eliminated any possibility of aborting the approach. They were landing on this sandbar whether the surface proved adequate or inadequate, whether her assessment was accurate or catastrophically wrong, because physics and geography had eliminated all alternatives. 200 feet, Chen continued the altitude callout. Speed 125 knots. Sink rate 700 feet per minute. The sandbar surface rushed up toward them, the packed sand showing increasing detail as they descended through the final 100 feet of altitude. Sarah flared slightly, raising the nose to arrest descent rate while bleeding off the final excess speed, aiming for touchdown that would be firm but controlled rather than catastrophic collision. 50 feet, Chen called. Speed 115 knots. Almost there. Sarah maintained the flare, feeling the aircraft settle toward the surface with the distinctive floating sensation that preceded touchdown in any landing, her mind calculating the precise moment to allow main gear contact while preventing nose gear from slamming down too hard during the transition from flying to ground contact. The main landing gear touched the packed sandbar surface with jarring impact that transmitted through the entire fuselage, a violent shudder that was rougher than any runway landing but which Sarah's experience immediately identified as within survivable parameters. The nose gear followed instantly, impacting with tremendous force that caused the cockpit to pitch forward before the nose gear compression absorbed the shock. They were down. On the sand. Still moving fast. The unprepared surface created immediate chaos that runway landings never experienced. The landing gear bounced and shuddered across packed sand that showed varying hardness, the fuselage shaking violently as wheels transmitted every surface irregularity directly into the aircraft structure, the sound of stressed metal and compressed suspension echoing through the cabin along with the roar of sand being thrown up by their passage. Sarah maintained absolute focus on directional control, using rudder and differential braking to keep the aircraft aligned with sandbar centerline as they decelerated across the rough surface. The sandbar width provided minimal margin for error, drift more than 50 feet laterally and they would impact forest with devastating results that would transform survival into tragedy. Hold centerline. Morrison shouted unnecessarily, his professional instincts making him call out what Sarah was already executing with perfect precision despite the violence of their passage across unprepared terrain. The packed sand surface held beneath their weight better than Morrison had feared but not as perfectly as Sarah had hoped. The main gear sank slightly into the surface with each compression cycle, creating additional drag that aided deceleration but which increased stress on landing gear structures not designed for such abuse. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel indicating landing gear stress, hydraulic pressure fluctuations, structural strain on lower fuselage components. Sarah ignored the warnings, focusing exclusively on keeping them centered on the sandbar while their speed bled off through aerodynamic drag and surface friction. They'd covered approximately 1,500 feet of the sandbar's 4,500-foot length, decelerating rapidly but still moving fast enough that any lateral deviation would be catastrophic. The right main gear hit a softer patch of sand without warning, causing the aircraft to yaw violently to the right as that gear sank deeper than the left. Sarah reacted instantly, applying left rudder and asymmetric braking to counteract the yaw, fighting to maintain centerline while the aircraft tried to weathervane toward the forest that bordered the sand 60 feet to their right. "Stay straight," Chen called out, her hands gripping the instrument panel as the aircraft shuddered and bounced across the rough surface while Sarah fought the controls to prevent catastrophic deviation. Sarah's hands worked with absolute precision born from hundreds of wilderness landings where rough surfaces demanded constant control inputs to prevent disaster. She corrected the yaw, bringing them back toward centerline while their forward speed continued decreasing through 2,000 feet of sandbar consumed, then 2,500 feet, then 3,000. The landing gear assemblies transmitted metallic groaning that indicated severe stress. They were taking damage, structures bending under forces that exceeded design parameters, but they were holding together sufficiently to keep the fuselage elevated above the surface and to provide continued directional control capability. 3,500 feet of sandbar consumed. 4,000 feet. Their speed decreased below 50 knots as aerodynamic drag and surface friction worked together to arrest their forward momentum. The forest at the sandbar's far end approached rapidly, but Sarah could see they would stop before impact, could calculate that their deceleration rate would bring them to rest with perhaps 200 feet of margin. At 4,200 feet from touchdown, the Boeing 737 shuddered to complete rest, sitting at slight angle on the packed sandbar surface with wisps of sand dust settling around the fuselage, landing gear assemblies visible damaged but intact, the aircraft battered and stressed but structurally sound enough that occupant survival had transitioned from possibility to accomplished reality. Silence filled the cockpit for 3 seconds as Morrison and Chen and Sarah processed what had just occurred. They'd landed a commercial airliner on an unprepared river sandbar in wilderness terrain, executing a landing that conventional aviation wisdom declared impossible, surviving through expertise that existed outside standard training because wilderness operations demanded capabilities that commercial flying never developed. Then Chen broke the silence with voice that mixed shock and amazement and overwhelming relief. "We're down. We're alive. Oh my God, we're actually alive." Sarah sat back in the captain's seat, her hands trembling slightly now that the absolute focus of landing execution could release its hold on her nervous system. She'd done it. She'd assessed wilderness terrain from altitude, identified viable landing surface, committed to approach in confined valley, executed touchdown on unprepared surface, maintained directional control during violent deceleration, and brought them to rest without catastrophic structural failure. 198 people aboard this aircraft were alive because she'd recognized that the captain's resignation represented conventional wisdom defeated by unconventional circumstances, and because she'd possessed exactly the wilderness aviation expertise needed when geography forced everyone into situation that commercial training never addressed. "Shut down all systems," Morrison ordered, his voice shaking as professional training reasserted itself. "Electrical, hydraulics, everything. Then evacuate immediately. We don't know if we have fuel leaks or fire hazards. Everyone out now." Sarah helped execute the shutdown procedures while flight attendants in the cabin initiated evacuation, passengers moving toward emergency exits with the desperate urgency of people who'd accepted death 15 minutes ago and now discovered they had unexpected chance at survival. The emergency slides deployed automatically, passengers sliding down onto the sandbar surface, stumbling away from the aircraft with expressions mixing disbelief and gratitude. Morrison opened the cockpit door, gesturing for Chen and Sarah to evacuate ahead of him. "Go. Both of you. I'll follow once I confirm the cabin is clear." Sarah moved toward the forward exit, her legs unsteady after the adrenaline surge of landing execution began wearing off. She descended the emergency slide onto the packed sandbar surface, the sand firm beneath her hiking boots exactly as her assessment had predicted, the wilderness surrounding them looking simultaneously beautiful and hostile under late afternoon light filtering through the valley. Passengers and crew gathered on the sandbar at safe distance from the aircraft, stunned faces turned toward the Boeing sitting at angle on the packed sand surface, landing gear assemblies visibly damaged, lower fuselage showing stress marks, but the structure fundamentally intact because Sarah's wilderness landing technique had distributed forces to preserve occupant safety despite severe aircraft damage. She heard helicopter rotors before seeing the aircraft, search and rescue responding with remarkable speed to the remote location. Medical evacuation helicopters appeared over the valley ridgeline, descending toward the sandbar where 198 people stood in various states of shock, processing survival that their captain had declared impossible until a passenger in hiking clothes revealed expertise that existed outside commercial aviation's normal boundaries. Morrison emerged from the forward exit last, sliding down to join the assembled group. His eyes found Sarah in the crowd, his expression carrying emotions too complex for simple gratitude. He crossed the sand to where she stood, extending his hand with formality that felt inadequate given what had just occurred. "I don't have words," he said, his voice thick. "You saved everyone aboard this aircraft. You did what I couldn't do because I didn't know how. I'm sorry I almost didn't listen to you." Sarah shook his hand, seeing in his face the complicated mixture of relief and professional humiliation that came from being rescued by expertise he hadn't recognized until desperate circumstances forced him to acknowledge knowledge existing outside his experience. "You made the right decision when it mattered most," she replied, her tone gentle. "Commercial training doesn't cover wilderness operations because commercial aircraft operate from prepared airports. You had no reason to know these techniques. What matters is that you recognized when unconventional expertise offered the only solution and you were willing to trust it despite how foreign it seemed to your training." Passengers began surrounding them, many crying, some attempting to express gratitude through words that felt insufficient for the enormity of what Sarah had accomplished. The sales representative from Portland who'd sat beside her in 19B stared with expression mixing recognition and amazement. "You said you were going camping or something," he managed, his voice breaking slightly. "I had no idea, you never mentioned you were a pilot, that you could do this." "Most people don't need to know," Sarah replied simply, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding their need to express gratitude towards someone who'd given them unexpected survival. "Wilderness aviation is specialized work. It doesn't come up in casual conversation." Emergency responders began arriving via helicopter, medical personnel triaging the passengers and crew for injuries, mostly minor sprains, bruises, stress reactions, but miraculously no serious casualties despite the violence of their wilderness landing. Additional helicopters landed on the sandbar downstream, bringing investigators and recovery teams who would examine the landing site and analyze exactly how a commercial Boeing had successfully landed on unprepared wilderness surface. An NTSB investigator approached Sarah within 30 minutes of landing, his expression mixing professional interest with barely concealed amazement. "Ms. Chen, I'm Senior Investigator Rodriguez with the National Transportation Safety Board. I need to understand exactly what happened here. The preliminary report from Air Traffic Control indicates you're a passenger who took control of the aircraft and executed this landing using wilderness aviation techniques." Sarah nodded, suddenly exhausted as adrenaline fully wore off and the weight of what she'd done began settling into her consciousness. "That's accurate. I'm a former bush pilot with 23 years' experience in remote wilderness operations. When the captain announced he couldn't reach any airports and would attempt crash landing in forest, I recognized that wilderness landing techniques might offer alternative. He accepted my credentials and relinquished control. I identified this sandbar as viable landing site and executed approach using off-airport landing procedures." Rodriguez stared at her, then at the aircraft sitting damaged but intact on the sandbar, then back at her. "Ms. Chen, in 30 years of aviation accident investigation, I have never encountered anything remotely comparable to this situation. Commercial aircraft simply don't land on river sandbars. The fact that everyone aboard survived it's extraordinary. I'm going to need extensive debriefing about your assessment process, your landing technique, everything. I'll provide whatever information you need," Sarah confirmed. "But the short version is that wilderness aviation develops capabilities that commercial training doesn't cover because commercial operations don't require them. Bush pilots learn to land on unprepared surfaces because that's where we operate. Today's situation required exactly those capabilities that commercial training excludes. I happened to be aboard with the relevant expertise at the exact moment when conventional knowledge couldn't solve the problem. Over the following hours, as helicopters evacuated passengers to medical facilities and investigators began preliminary examination of the landing site, the full scope of what had occurred began emerging. Captain Morrison had correctly calculated that dual-engine failure placed them beyond glide range of any prepared airport, correctly assessed that commercial training provided no solution to their impossible situation, and correctly surrendered to what appeared inevitable death. But his commercial training had taught him that aircraft required prepared runways, that wilderness terrain equaled catastrophic crash, that landing on unprepared surfaces meant certain fatality. Those assumptions were true within commercial aviation's operational boundaries but false within wilderness aviation's expanded capabilities. Sarah's bush pilot expertise had recognized what Morrison couldn't see, that wilderness terrain contained hidden landing opportunities if you possessed knowledge to identify them, that packed sandbars could support aircraft weight if assessed correctly, that rough landings causing structural damage were acceptable outcomes when the alternative was no landing at all. Her career landing small aircraft on frozen lakes and mountain meadows had developed assessment skills and execution capabilities that scaled to larger aircraft when circumstances demanded. Her hundreds of wilderness landings had built intuitive understanding of terrain characteristics, surface viability, approach geometry, and acceptable risk tolerances that existed nowhere in commercial pilot training because airlines simply never operated in environments where such knowledge was required. She transformed from outdoor dressed passenger in seat 19B to revealed wilderness aviation specialist to life-saving expert executing impossible landing precisely because her expertise existed outside conventional boundaries. Her quiet statement, "I will land this," wasn't bravado but professional assessment from someone whose entire career involved landing where conventional pilots never dared operate. As sunset painted the Mission River Valley in amber light, Sarah sat on the sandbar watching investigators examine the aircraft while exhaustion and complicated emotions washed through her consciousness. She'd retired from bush piloting 6 months ago, accepting that her wilderness aviation career had ended, transitioning toward less demanding work that wouldn't require the constant edge of capability operations that bush flying demanded. Today had proven that expertise never truly retired, that decades of specialized knowledge remained available when circumstances demanded, that unconventional capabilities possessed value even in situations that seemed impossible specifically because they existed outside conventional operational boundaries. She thought about the captain's resigned announcement that had catalyzed her decision to act. "I don't know how to land in wilderness because my training never covered it. Bush pilots operate in terrain like this, but I'm not a bush pilot." She was exactly what he wasn't. Her response hadn't been to feel superior about possessing specialized knowledge but rather to recognize that sometimes survival depended on expertise existing outside mainstream training, that unconventional knowledge solved problems that conventional wisdom declared unsolvable, that specialized capabilities developed in remote wilderness operations could save lives when geography forced everyone into situations that standard procedures couldn't address. Morrison approached as twilight settled over the valley, his expression carrying weight of someone processing survival that contradicted every calculation he'd made during those desperate minutes of powerless glide toward what he believed was certain death. "The investigators are calling this the most successful emergency off-airport landing in commercial aviation history," he said quietly, settling onto the sand beside her. "They're saying your assessment of the sandbar surface, your approach execution, your landing technique, all of it demonstrates expertise that exists nowhere in standard training. They want to study what you did, analyze the techniques, possibly develop protocols for wilderness emergency situations based on your capabilities." Sarah absorbed that information with mixed feelings. Bush pilots have been executing these landings for decades in smaller aircraft. The principles don't change with scale, just the stakes. "I'd be happy to share knowledge if it helps others, but honestly, the reason commercial pilots don't learn wilderness landing technique is because commercial operations don't require it. You fly between prepared airports with infrastructure. That's the entire operational model. Wilderness landing is edge case that almost never occurs." "Except it occurred today," Morrison countered gently. "And 198 people are alive because someone aboard possessed edge case expertise exactly when edge case circumstances demanded it. That's not luck, Sarah. That's the value of specialized knowledge even when mainstream systems don't recognize that value until crisis reveals it. They sat in companionable silence as stars began appearing in the darkening sky above the valley, surrounded by wilderness that had nearly claimed their lives but which Sarah's expertise had transformed from execution ground to salvation precisely because she'd learned to see terrain not as threat but as opportunity if you possessed knowledge to assess it correctly. The helicopters would evacuate everyone by morning, taking them to civilization, medical care, reunion with families who'd begun grieving before learning that impossible survival had occurred. Investigators would spend weeks analyzing the landing site, the aircraft damage, the techniques Sarah employed. Media would transform her into reluctant hero despite her discomfort with attention. But in this moment, Sarah Chen sat on packed sandbar in Mission River Valley Wilderness, feeling the evening breeze carrying forest scents, hearing the river's quiet flow nearby, knowing that her 23 years of wilderness aviation expertise had proven its value in the most dramatic way possible when conventional knowledge encountered situations that demanded unconventional solutions. She'd landed where runways didn't exist because she'd spent her career learning that runways were optional if you possessed sufficient expertise. She'd saved lives because she'd recognized that the captain's resignation represented not failure of skill but limitation of training that excluded knowledge she'd devoted decades to developing. Sometimes survival required someone who understood that wilderness terrain wasn't automatically fatal, who knew that rivers created landing opportunities through seasonal water dynamics, who'd executed hundreds of off-airport operations that taught principles applicable when geography and catastrophic failure conspired to demand exactly the specialized capabilities that mainstream systems never bothered to develop because they seemed unnecessary until the moment when they became absolutely essential. "I will land this," she'd said. And she had. Because bush pilots learned long ago that wilderness aviation meant landing where others wouldn't dare, and sometimes that wilderness expertise saved lives in situations where conventional wisdom saw only inevitable death. The wilderness around them stood silent witness to that truth, the sandbar bearing marks of their passage, the Boeing resting at angle under emerging stars, 198 lives continuing because someone had possessed knowledge that existed outside commercial aviation's comfortable boundaries and had trusted that knowledge sufficiently to execute landing that conventional training declared impossible. Sarah Chen, former bush pilot turned outdoor recreation consultant turned impromptu commercial aircraft wilderness landing specialist, sat in the gathering darkness feeling the weight of responsibility lifting, the satisfaction of expertise validated, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes being the outdoor-dressed passenger in seat 19B meant possessing exactly the capabilities needed when conventional options failed and wilderness became not obstacle but opportunity for those who knew how to read its features correctly. The Mission River flowed onward through the valley, patient and eternal, caring nothing for human drama, continuing its geological work of shaping terrain. But that terrain had shaped human destiny today, transformed from threat to salvation through knowledge that recognized opportunity where others saw only death, through expertise that executed precision where others anticipated catastrophe, through wilderness aviation capabilities that proved their value by landing where conventional wisdom said landing was impossible. And 198 people would carry that truth forward with their unexpectedly continuing lives, testimony to the value of specialized knowledge, unconventional expertise, and the determined voice of someone who'd looked at impossible circumstances and said with calm professional certainty, "I will land this."